G'day folks, and welcome to this second part of this rules primer for Nations in Arms, published by Compass Games. In this video, building upon the first, we're going to cover supply and attrition, and then the battle procedure, covering land combat. We'll look at sieges and siege resolution, siege attempts. We'll look at naval warfare, and some of the special naval units that apply in this game. First, we'll talk about supply. And I'll start with one of the easiest rules, and that is that naval units are always in supply, so you don't have to worry about those. Land units, however, check supply in three situations. The first is at the beginning of a leader activation. Whenever a leader or an army activates, they check for supply. And if they're out of supply, you simply place an out of supply marker above them. And I'll talk about the effects of this in just a moment. You also check supply during combat resolution for the defender, and you check supply again at the end of combat resolution for the phasing player, the active player. Now there are various supply effects, there are various out of supply die roll modifiers for combat and things like that. When an out of supply unit is activated, they suffer mandatory attrition at the moment of activation. Artillery is unavailable for combat and sieges if the unit is out of supply. I mentioned those negative dice roll modifiers for combat and sieges. Your engineering capabilities are unavailable, and demoralized units, I'll talk about this in a moment, that are out of supply are unable to rally. Now, to be in supply, units at that point need to be able to draw a supply line to a supply source. And there are several valid types of supply sources. They include active controlled fortresses on national territory. They include the capital of that unit's country. And there are some special rules which I'll talk about for minor allies as well. For minor powers, they can draw supply to the capital city of their country if it contains a fortress, or they can draw supply to the capital city of the major power that they're allied to. But it's not just a simple case of drawing a line. You need to forge a line of supply links to those supply sources. And these supply links need to be spaced every 4 movement points. Not every 4 hexes, but every 4 movement points. So you need to have these links back to that supply source. And these links can be things like an allied unbesieged fortress, a captured and reactivated enemy fortress, depots, and I mentioned depots in the first video. Trains are not valid supply links, but when they're flipped over to their depot side, they become valid supply links. And finally, detachments are one of those common supply links. Your detached units, as such, can form links in that chain. Now, it's not enough just to draw a supply line. You need to be careful where that line travels. Things like the area of influence, those 6 hexes around an army, block supply. Even if there are friendly units or fortresses present, they do not block that enemy army's area of influence. But this is slightly reduced when we're talking about a leader without an army. With a leader without an army, only their contact point blocks supply, not the 2 adjacent hexes. Okay, so armies, it is the 6 surrounding hexes, their point of contact, and the 2 surrounding adjacent contact hexes. But with a leader without an army, just with a small force, it is just that point of contact that blocks supply. And of course, as you might expect, enemy combat units block supply, enemy guerrillas, Cossacks, depots, unbesieged enemy fortresses, and of course hexes in neutral, minor or major powers. You cannot trace supply through their terrain. And just a reminder, I mentioned in the first video that fortresses can supply you your steps up to, within their walls, up to their fortress level. They can stack any number of units within their walls, but any steps in excess of their fortress level cannot be supplied, and thus basically suffer from attrition and suffer the out of supply effects such as combat penalties and so forth. A besieged fortress also can't be used as a supply link. So as you're moving your armies and your forces around, you may drop off these depots to build these supply links back to a supply source to give you supply lines to your armies and forces. You can also detach depots along the way, and you can reintegrate a depot into an army through those integration rules that I mentioned in the first part. They're basically, when they integrate, they flip back over to the train side and become mobile again, moving with the army. There are a few other special rules when it comes to depots. If an army or a force is sort of moving out of that supply area and they have a depot with them or a train, they can spend that depot or train to kind of draw on emergency supply and benefit from a positive dice roll modifier during their attrition check. But in doing so, that depot or train is then eliminated. Depots can also be placed in sort of harbours that are, even if they're under siege, and the depot effectively links that harbour via the seas with other supply source, and thus can serve as a supply source by themselves, provided the adjacent sea zones aren't exclusively controlled by enemy fleets. And just to clarify, again, if you're planning to invade England or any other area where you're sort of drawing supply across a strait, straits do not block supply. You can trace supply across those straits, providing the sea area where that strait is not exclusively controlled by enemy fleets. So one of the main impacts of being out of supply is the making of attrition checks. I'll talk about this in just a moment. But first of all, a few units are exempt from this. Guerrillas, engineers, depots and trains, and permanent fortresses never check supply. They're never counted within a hex when calculating attrition. I mentioned when you activate a leader for movement, they check for supply and may suffer attrition. That's when activated for movement. Other forms of movement like combat avoidance, interception, march into the sound of the guns, which I'll talk about in a moment, and retreat after combat don't trigger an attrition check. They're forms of movement, but they're not those activations. Bear in mind, as I mentioned, that the defender checks for supply during the combat resolution phase. The phasing player checks after combat, but that's separate from those other forms of movement, combat avoidance, interception, and so forth. So attrition checks are used by those out of supply units when they're activated in other circumstances, but you'll also make an attrition check in several other circumstances, and I hinted at some of these earlier. When a force activates for the second time, so let's say they've had their first activation and they were to activate again, on their second activation, before their activation is over, they'll make that attrition check. And if they're out of supply during that second activation, there'll be an additional negative dice roll modifier. This is very similar and pretty much the same as if a unit is using that extended movement, which I talked about earlier. And then there's a final attrition phase in the game, and it's during this phase that you'll roll again for demoralized units, out of supply units that weren't activated. So if they were activated, they would have rolled at that time. But if they weren't activated during the turn, they'll roll for attrition then. And then you also roll for attrition for those besieged units. Now an attrition check is pretty straightforward. You roll 2d6 and cross-reference the result on this attrition table with the number of steps or strength points in the hex. Now there are various modifiers for this, and the modifiers vary depending on the situation, whether what season it is, what hex they're in, if they've moved or if they've just activated, if they're demoralized, if they're spinning a wagon and so forth. I won't go through all those, but it's fairly straightforward. Just look at the die roll modifiers below the table, count your SPs, and then make the die roll and apply the effects. And this could be things like suffering step losses. Sometimes there are cavalry specific step losses, things like that. And you just apply that to the stack that you're checking. All right, let's move on to talk about combat and battles. And the first thing I want to clarify is that overrun, which I discussed during the movement procedures of the first video, is not a battle. It is a part of movement, not combat. Instead, there are three types of battles: skirmishes, minor battles, and major battles. A major battle involves at least 21 steps from both sides, with at least 9 steps from the weaker side. A minor battle takes place between 9 and 20 steps, or if there are 21 or more steps but the weaker side doesn't have at least those 9 steps. So it would meet the criteria for the major battle, but the weaker side has less than 9 steps. And a skirmish occurs in circumstances less than that. Basically, if there are no more than 8 steps participating in the battle from both sides combined. Keeping in mind again that army markers, engineers and supply units are not combat units or steps for these purposes. They're not taken into account for force size. Now the size of the battle, whether it's a skirmish, minor battle or major battle, determines which combat results table you'll use, how many losses will occur, and sometimes various other effects like the loss of a leader and so forth. So the battle procedure begins with the preliminary phase, and the first thing that happens is that Allied units march to the sound of the guns. The attacker checks first, and they check for Allied leaders that are adjacent to the battle hex. So first of all, if there are any French leaders in these adjacent hexes, they will basically make an attempt on 2d6, needing a 10 or more to march to the sound of the battle. That roll is modified by the combat bonus of the leader attempting that, by the army commander's combat bonus if an army is present in the battle, or if it joins one of its corps. But it's penalised by things like attempting to join the battle by crossing an unbridged river, demoralization, and being out of supply. Once the attacker has made their determination, the defenders does the same thing, and they check any defending units adjacent to the battle hex, and they'll make similar rolls. Now again, this is not activating these units for movement, and they don't trigger attrition checks for marching to the sound of the guns. Now in effect, because you may have several forces coming together, you may have a sort of a forced integration or absorption of forces. You can have an army integrating with a force in that hex, or even detachments adjacent to that area marching to absorb into that target hex. You do, however, have to ensure that you don't exceed the command capacity of that hex. So you can't have sort of multiple independent forces joining without an army command in that area. Now with that done and your forces in place, you determine your force morale. This is where those morale factors come into play for your various units. To calculate your force morale, you determine what morale value is the most numerous among your steps, the most common. What morale value do you have the most of, basically? But again, you're counting steps, not just counters. If 2 values are the same, you can choose which one you want to use. And the thing to keep in mind here, you want high morale, but you also need to keep in mind that half of the losses suffered will apply to those steps of the morale value used. So if you pick a high morale value, sure, you have high morale for the combat, but half your steps will also come from those high morale units. Now the next step is an optional rule that applies to major battles only. You don't have to use this rule. It adds some, I guess, an extra degree of uncertainty and I guess randomness to battles, and that is to shuffle the deck of 30 tactics cards. Now each player will draw a certain number of cards. They will pick one card to play, and it'll sort of vary their dice roll modifiers, or sometimes based on their force composition or their artillery. It'll cancel other cards and so forth. And again, this is just another layer of uncertainty to add to your combat if you wish. Now, technically, the next step in the combat procedure is called calculating combat odds. But really what you're doing here is considering all the die roll modifiers that apply. And one of the modifiers that apply is the combat odds ratio. You don't roll on a combat odds table like many other war games. Instead, you determine the combat odds for the two forces. Basically, you divide the attacker combat value by the defender's combat value to get a ratio, and that ratio will give you a die roll modifier that you'll apply to the final combat. But it's not the only thing. It's not the only modifier that applies. So first of all, you'll determine that combat strength ratio. It'll give you a die roll modifier, and then you'll consider other modifiers that apply as well. So for example, you'll also at this stage calculate artillery superiority. And basically the side with the most artillery points, adding up all your artillery points, gets a +1 dice roll modifier. Or if you have twice as many artillery points as your opponent, you get a +2 dice roll modifier. You determine cavalry superiority. The side with the most cavalry steps gets a +1 die roll modifier. Again, if you have more than twice your opponent, you get a +2. In both of these cases, artillery and cavalry, if your opponent has 0 steps and you have at least 1, you count this as double, and so you get a +2. And I'm sure the mathematicians there are shaking their head in frustration, but that's the rule. And then there are also some terrain effects that might apply. You might consider other combat bonuses and other circumstances, and you apply all these modifiers and keep them in mind. Sum them up, add, subtract, and work out a final odds modifier. Now, during that combat odds ratio calculation, there are two special rules that apply. If the attacker outnumbers the defender by 5 to 1, the weaker side is instantly, entirely destroyed. It's like an overrun, but it takes place during the combat phase. If the combat ratio is 3 to 1 or more, the leaders on that stronger side are exempt from leader casualty checks that may be rolled on the table. But yeah, basically if you have 3 to 1 or more, your leaders are exempt from that check. And the final step before rolling the dice is to determine the lead assault unit and subordinate leader modifier. Basically, you designate a corps as your lead assault unit, and you apply that unit's combat modifier to the battle. I mentioned this way back at the start of the first part of this rules primer. You look at that lead unit's combat modifier, and that is the dice roll modifier that applies for this lead unit designation. As I mentioned back then, this is also the unit that will suffer the first loss in battle. You also designate a subordinate leader to use their combat modifier, and that leader will have to check for a casualty. So each side adds up their die roll modifiers from these various things, and they roll 2d6 each. So the attacker rolls 2d6, applies their modifier, defender does the same. You consult the combat results table based on what type of battle it was: a skirmish, a minor battle, or a major battle. And then you apply the effects, basically, of what you've rolled on that table. It could be step losses, it could be cavalry losses, it could be leader casualty checks, and so forth. Now, a key consideration here is that a force cannot inflict more casualties on the enemy than their force size. So if the attacker only has 2 steps and they score 3 hits, the defender will only suffer 2 hits, because that's the size of the attacking force. If you are required to make a leader casualty check, you simply make a d6 roll on the table and apply the results. Now, keeping in mind that army leaders never check for leader casualty. These are either your subordinate leaders or a leader commanding a force. If a leader is wounded, he returns to the reserve pool during the reinforcement phase of the next turn. A replacement leader can be randomly picked from the reserve pool if there are any, but they must be able to command that force. If a leader is killed, he's removed from the game, and a replacement leader is immediately picked from the leader pool at random. If a unit is destroyed, its leader is returned to the pool, and if in dire circumstances there are no more replacement leaders in the leader pool and stacking limits in that hex are exceeded, then you need to remove any excess steps from that hex immediately. So after making those dice rolls and figuring out the result, you determine who has won the battle. Now, typically the winning side is the side which inflicts the most step losses on its enemy from that table, not from other effects, just from that combat results table and that die roll. If they cause equal losses, then you check to see if either side has a little plus sign next to their result. If one side has that plus sign and the other doesn't, then the side with the little plus sign gets a slight advantage and they win the battle. If neither side has a plus sign, or if both sides have a plus sign, then the attacker can choose to fight a second round of combat or to retreat. If they opt to fight, the defender then gets a choice. Do they want to fight a second round or retreat? If in this determination the attacker chooses first, and if the attacker chooses to retreat, they're deemed to have lost the battle. If both sides decide to fight, basically you fight a second round, nobody has lost just yet, no demoralization check takes place just yet. You'll basically fight another round of combat, and if basically there's another tie and the defender has not yet been forced to retreat, then the attacker is deemed to have lost the battle and they must retreat. So it's 2 rounds maximum. In short, the side that is ultimately forced to retreat is the loser of that battle. The second round of combat, if it gets to that, is resolved exactly like the first, with the same phases, including another opportunity to march to the sound of the guns, another die roll. You do morale determination, combat odds. You can play tactic cards again if you're using that rule and it's a major battle. And you make another battle determination. So, when either the attacker or the defender loses a battle, the loser must retreat. And they can decide whether they want to retreat 1 or 2 spaces, but there are various restrictions on this. If the phasing player is forced to retreat, so the battle's taking place here, they have to retreat to the space they entered, so they'll return back to there. The defender has, I guess, a few different choices, but some restrictions on their retreat. So obviously they can't retreat into the space from where their opponent entered that battle hex. They need to try to retreat closer to their supply source. They can't retreat into a hex with an enemy fortress. They can't retreat into a neutral country. You can retreat into a hex with an enemy force if you can overrun them. So normally you can't retreat into an enemy force, but if you can overrun that enemy force, you can retreat into there. Generally, you only want to do this if you're desperate, because every step lost by that overran force causes a step loss for that retreating force as well. Retreats can cross an unbridged river. They can cross a bridged river normally, but they can cross an unbridged river, but they suffer an additional 2-step loss to the force, unless you have those engineers or that intrinsic engineers with an army, in which case you lose just 1 step from that force. You should try to avoid retreating into an enemy's contact area or zone of influence. If you must retreat into one of these, you lose 2 additional steps for each hex that you retreat through in an enemy zone of influence, and 3 additional steps through each enemy contact area. However, in those last cases, that retreating through enemy zone of influence and enemy contact area, the presence of friendly units in those zones partially negates that. Losses are reduced by 1 step for each of those hexes if it contains a friendly unit or friendly unbesieged fortress. So you will still suffer some step losses, but the presence of those friendly forces or fortresses helps reduce it just a little bit. If no retreat is possible, for whatever reason, the retreating force is destroyed. And if you lose a battle, as in this case, let's say, in a hex with a fortress, you can retreat into that fortress. Of course, the battle has taken place first, and then you're retreating into the fortress. A retreating force can also absorb or integrate other friendly units in those hexes along its retreat path, and of course keeping in mind possible contamination of their activation levels and demoralization levels as well. If a unit in a harbour must retreat and you have fleets in the adjacent area sufficient to carry that force can redeploy into a friendly harbour within the movement factor of those fleets. That retreat by the sea, however, is subject to interception and possible naval combat, and that naval retreat will automatically be intercepted if there are enemy blockades in effect. In effect, your fleet will be leaving the harbour, and if there's a blockade there, as I mentioned in the last video, that interception is automatic. Otherwise, if that's not possible, units must retreat by land, and again, if they can't retreat, they're eliminated. Now, after the battle and after those retreats, the loser of a minor or major battle must make a demoralization check. Losses in skirmishes don't cause this check unless during a siege battle. Now, basically what happens here is the losing side rolls 1d6 and suffers demoralization if their modified result is greater than the force morale. This is one reason why you want to have a high force morale, but there are various factors that apply. You apply to this die roll the overall commander's combat bonus. If that overall commander, excluding army commanders, is killed, there's a -1 modifier. And then you apply as a modifier the difference between the total effective losses between the loser and the winner. And this includes those losses during retreat. And this is why this takes place after retreat. You may lose additional steps during that retreat, and you factor them into this difference as well. And so, yeah, basically you make these modifiers, roll 1d6, and you need to roll greater than the force morale that you determined earlier. Immediately after making that demoralization check, if the defeated force becomes demoralized, there is possible cavalry pursuit. And basically, if there is surviving cavalry on the victorious side, they'll pursue that defeated, demoralized force, and it can cause additional step or supply unit losses. There's basically one additional step loss for each pursuing light or guard cavalry step, and for every 2 cuirassier cavalry steps in total. In addition, of course, that force becomes demoralized. Place a demoralized marker on it, and there are ongoing demoralized effects. They can, as I mentioned earlier, they can automatically avoid combat if they're attacked again. Their force morale is lowered by 1 point, and that includes using morale for rally attempts. A demoralized force cannot attempt to intercept enemy forces, and a demoralized army loses its area of influence. If a demoralized force, army or force, is involved in combat again and is demoralized a second time, that force or army is completely destroyed. So they're very vulnerable whilst demoralized. And there's a -2 dice roll modifier to those demoralized units during that combat resolution. So for these reasons, you'll want to rally your troops as soon as possible. And rally attempts are fairly straightforward. At the beginning of a leader's activation, they can attempt to rally their in-supply demoralized troops. They must be in supply. To do so, they basically spend 3 movement points and roll 1d6. They apply their combat modifier to that roll, and they need to roll equal to or less than their force morale. Now keep in mind that there's that -1 modifier to their force morale. So equal to or less than their, in effect, their force morale -1 for being demoralized. If they succeed, the force rallies and is no longer demoralized. If they fail, they remain demoralized. Their status doesn't change. And they can attempt to rally as much as their, force movement factor allows. Now, at the end of combat, if the phasing player was victorious, they can, as I mentioned earlier, continue their movement, but they must spend 1 movement point because of the battle. That's not to enter the hex, that's the 1 movement point for taking part in a battle. Okay, let's talk about sieges and siege attempts and a little bit more about fortresses. To lay siege to a fortress, the attacking player must have as many steps as the level of that fortress, if it's 1 or 2. Or as I mentioned earlier, in the case of a level 3 fortress, you must have an army marker. Now, to make a siege attempt, the attacker must spend movement points equal to the level of the fortress. So in this case, Ott must spend 2 movement points. And he can make several siege attempts up to his movement allowance within a turn. There are some exceptions to this though. If the phasing player won a battle in that fortress hex, they can immediately make a siege attempt at no movement point cost. If at the end of the besieger's movement, the siege was laid without that prior combat, they can also execute a siege attempt. And siege attempts work pretty much in a similar way to combats, except you're attacking these fortresses. There are 3 different columns for a Fortress 1, a Fortress 2, and a Fortress 3. You roll 2d6 and apply these various modifiers. You'll determine again, just like combat, if you have artillery superiority, you'll apply the leader combat value differential. I mentioned early that engineers can provide a +1 siege modifier. I mentioned that army markers that are in supply provide siege modifiers, and you also get modifiers for the duration of the siege. You can see the +1 there. So the longer the siege goes on, the greater that modifier becomes. You roll 2d6, apply these modifiers, and then determine and resolve the results based on your die roll. It might be the besieging forces repulse with step losses. It might be an assault, so a round of land battle takes place. Honours result means that the fortress surrenders. A breach gives you 1 standard round of land combat, but the besieged force is destroyed at the end of the battle. So various quite different effects from those siege results. One thing to keep in mind is that all fortresses have a morale value of 3, regardless of whether they're 1, 2, or 3. They have a morale value of 3, but they have combat and artillery values equal to their fortress level. But if there are defending troops inside the fortress and they have more steps than the fortress value, you use their morale value instead of the fortress morale value of 3. Now, if you roll that assault or breach result, which causes you to fight 1 round of a land battle, there are a few things to keep in mind. There are no terrain effects. There's no cavalry pursuit possible. No tactics cards are possible. This is basically considered a skirmish type of battle. Regardless of how many steps, it's a skirmish battle, and you use the skirmish column on that combat results table. And the besieged side cannot cause more casualties than its remaining permanent fortress points plus the combat points of the units within the fortress. So it's similar to those combat rules, but taking into account the fortress points. And the besieged side benefits from a leader's combat point if there is a leader present. And just a reminder, this is only 1 round of combat, but the loser doesn't necessarily retreat after combat. You apply basically the results of what you rolled. If during that round of combat there is a tied result, then you treat this as the besieging units having the repulsed result on that siege table. Now, during that one round of combat, let's say it's an assault, step losses resulting from that combat can be satisfied by either reducing the strength of units in the fortress as normal, or by reducing the level of the fortress, as shown by this marker. So -1 or -2 steps to show that. If during that round of combat the besieged units lose the battle and are demoralized, then the fortress instantly surrenders and the units present within that fortress, the besieged units, are all destroyed. The result is the same if the fortress only has its permanent points left. Now, it may be the case that during that one round of combat, the attacker and the defender may be eliminated simultaneously. Now, an assault is in effect an attack on a standing fortress, and if the attacker and the defender are both destroyed simultaneously, the hex remains under the control of the defender, but if the fortress is destroyed, it's considered empty and doesn't benefit from the benefits of a fortress until it's reactivated. If there's a breach, however, this is considered a significant breach in the fortress walls. Regardless of what happens, the defenders are all destroyed anyway. If the attackers are all destroyed, then they, in effect, gain control of the fortress, but it becomes an empty fortress under their control. And Honours of War is very different to both of these. The fortress surrenders, becomes deactivated, but that besieged force survives and returns during next spring's reinforcement segment. Now, if the attacker captures the fortress, they can spend a supply unit or assign a combat point from a unit to, in effect, garrison the hex. And in doing so, they effectively own that fortress, and they retain its sort of fortress value. If for some reason they don't want to or can't do that, then we place a fortress removed marker on that, and until they garrison that fortress again, it is simply considered an open simple city and not a fortress. There are two kind of special circumstances where the siege may be raised. First of all, if the number of steps necessary to maintain that siege is not met, if they drop below that fortress level, the siege is raised and those besieging units must redeploy using the retreat rules into an adjacent hex and as close as possible to their supply source per the normal retreat rules. If a force friendly to the besieged fortress enters the hex, a battle occurs, but those besieged units don't take part in that battle. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the loss of those permanent points does not reduce the fortress level. So if Genoa has lost 1 fortress point, it is still considered a level 2 fortress. Okay, let's talk briefly about naval warfare. Naval warfare is fairly straightforward. Basically, each side involved rolls 1d6, the attacker rolls a d6 and applies their modifiers, and the defender rolls a d6 and applies their modifiers. And you determine the difference between the two. What's important here is that if you have a squadron, more than one fleet, then each admiral applies his own bonus to the fleet he commands. So you go through every fleet. So having, in effect, 3 fleets in a squadron gives you 3 of those admiral's modifiers to apply. Again, you determine the difference between those 2 results, and then you may apply losses. It might be things like retreating, fleets being sunk, and yeah, that's about it. Now, in the case of a tie, the non-phasing player determines whether they want to retreat or stay. As with battles, if they decide to retreat, they are considered the loser. If they stay, it then goes to the phasing player to determine whether they want to retreat or stay. If they retreat, they're the loser. But if they also decide to stay, then a second round of naval warfare is determined. And it's my understanding that this can continue for a third, fourth, and so on until finally someone decides to retreat, should you roll that many ties. Now, retreats during naval warfare aren't just to adjacent spaces. There are several options. The retreat can go to a harbour in the same area, and if it's the phasing player retreating to a harbour after losing a battle, that ends their activation. They have to stop there. It can be a friendly harbour within the movement factor range of the fleet. However, that retreat movement to it might be a harbour sort of a fair distance away. It can't take place through sea areas under the exclusive control of enemy fleets at sea. You can also retreat to the sea area, if you're the phasing player, retreat to the sea area from where you entered the battle at a cost of 1 movement point. If the loser decided to retreat to a harbour, then the winner, which can include the non-phasing player, can pursue that loser and blockade the harbour if they have enough movement points to do so. But establishing that blockade will end the activation for that, if it's the activated fleet, just like retreating into a harbour would do. Now, if the phasing player lost the combat and retreated somewhere else, not into a harbour, remember, if they retreat into a harbour, the activation ends. If they retreat into an adjacent sea zone, they can't re-enter the sea zone where the battle just took place. So they can't lose a battle, retreat, and then because they still have movement points left over, they can't recommence that battle. However, they can still use their movement points to go elsewhere, just as long as they don't start that battle all over again. If a fleet in let's say here, these French guys, if they lose a battle in a blockaded harbour, they can only retreat back into that harbour. They can't go anywhere else. Now, in the first part of this video, I spoke about how you can fight naval battles within an enemy harbour. So these English here could sail into the harbour to fight a battle. However, it's dangerous to do so. Each permanent fortress point gives a +2 dice roll modifier to that 1d6 roll if there are fleets present. If there are no fleets present, they still provide a die roll, but they only provide that +2 dice roll modifier for every fortress level above the first level. So you'd need, for an unoccupied harbour, a level 2 or greater. Now, in that case, if you're attacking a harbour from the blockade box and you're forced to retreat, you just retreat back to that blockade box and resume the blockade, but no additional combat takes place. Now, if the defender in a harbour is attacked by these blockading units or other units, and they lose that battle, they face 2 choices. They can either stay in the harbour and the blockade is resumed or commenced, or they can try to make a run for it. They can be forced out of the harbour and move to a friendly harbour within their movement factor range. But if they decide to do so, they may be intercepted by other enemy fleets on their route. And whilst I mentioned that an attacker who retreats can't recommence a battle, in this case, because they were victorious, they can pursue that enemy fleet and potentially engage them again. That's if the phasing player was victorious. Now, there are 2 types of fleets. There are geographically oriented fleets, which will have an area name, and then there are named admirals, the person's name and face. If a fleet with a named admiral is lost, then you roll 2d6 for that named admiral, and a roll of 12, that admiral is killed, and you remove their counter from the game permanently. You don't do that for geographically oriented or named fleets. Some fleets are nothing more than decoys, and if a decoy fleet is engaged in battle by the enemy, they are automatically destroyed, regardless of what the outcome is. Now, the French also have access to these corsairs. They're special types of fleets, and they're pretty clear because of the red number here and the skull and crossbones down in the bottom right corner. Now this rating indicates their impact on British trade. The way this works is when you purchase a Corsair, you randomly draw these. So you don't get to choose which one you want. You randomly draw a Corsair, and they're placed in a special Corsairs box. And during the spring budget phase, first of all, coalition fleets may have the opportunity to attack these, and then any surviving Corsairs can attack British trade. I won't go into detail, but basically the way this works is the British can place their fleets in an escort box, and fleets in that escort box need to try to detect the Corsairs by rolling on a 1d6 5 or more. Those Corsairs that they detect can then be attacked by the fleet, and they'll be sunk on a roll of 5 or more. Any Corsairs that survive then roll die to determine how much money they steal from the British, and there's a special Corsair table to determine that. Okay, well that about concludes it for this second video. We've gone through supply, attrition and attrition checks, battle procedure for land combat, siege resolution and naval warfare. That is, I think, enough to get you started with the small scenarios. For the larger campaign scenarios, you'll need to read more about the diplomacy and events phase, economics and budget, conquest and peace, and various other special rules for the other forces that may be involved. But many of those are scenario specific, so you don't need to read those at the start. Just read those when you get to those specific scenarios. But at this point, we're about 2/3 of the way through the rulebook, and hopefully you've got a clear enough foundation to get started with many, if not most, of those small scenarios. That is Nations in Arms by Compass Games. Hope you enjoy it.